Dear students, welcome to the presentation of Unit 8, World Population. This tries to substitute the explanation we will receive in a regular class. This is a pre-recorded video, so you can stop it, you can go back, you can take notes, or listen it whenever you want. Please pay attention as we are trying to indicate the most important part and try to solve the most common problems. Let's start with the definition of demography. We already know that, but it's the science that studies the population, the distribution of people throughout the world, the growth of population throughout the centuries, and the characteristics, the amount of children, old people, women, men, etc. Here we can see that in the world there are 7 billion people that has continuously grown throughout the centuries. Here we can see a list of the most populated countries with China on the top with 1.5 billion, then India with more than 1 billion, and then in third place, but far from the other two, is the United States with 300 million. Most of the countries, China, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, part of Russia, Philippines, Vietnam, Iran and Thailand are in Asia, which is the most populated continent of the world. Then there are many countries in Africa, such as Nigeria or Ethiopia, which is the fastest growing area in our world. Here we can see the distribution of people in the world with Southeast Asia as the most populated area, and then some areas without almost people, such as the deserts, the Sahara, the Kalahari, the Australian desert, the Kazakhstan desert, and so on. The cold areas, north of Russia, Siberia, north of Canada, Greenland, and the Patagonia and the Antarctica, the north and then the south, and then the high mountains such as the Himalayas or the jungles, the Amazon, Congo, Borneo, and so on, which are areas that not favor the allocation of people. Here we can see the evolution of the population of the world. Asia was the most populated area in previous centuries, then Europe grew a lot, but then Asia again, and it's expected that in the future Africa will be the most populated area in our planet. This is a map that changed the size of the countries according to the. This map that we already have seen shows that inside this circle there are more people than outside it because it shows China, India, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, and so on. This is a map that shows in red Bangladesh that has as many people as all the areas in blue that cover some of the less populated areas in the world, while Bangladesh is a highly populated country. This is a map that relocates a country according to their population. Then the biggest population, which is China, is in the largest country. That will be Russia. Then the second one, India, will be in the second largest one, which will be Canada. The third one in the third place, and so on. Here we can start with the rates, which are one of the most important parts of our unit. This is the birth rate that calculates the number of births divided between the number of inhabitants, so the people that live in a country, per 1,000. The result of this is in per mile, such as 30 per mile, meaning that there are 30 births per 1,000 people. Remember that per mile is represented like a percentage, but with two zeros, like this. Here we can see a map of the fertility rate, which is another way to show the births in a country. And we can easily notice that uh, the countries with the highest birth rate are in Africa, especially at the south of the Sahara Desert. So those are the countries that we call sub-Saharan countries. Also in some areas of Central Asia and South America that also has high birth rates. The lowest birth rates in the world are in Western Europe, North America, especially Canada, the center of Europe and Russia, and some part of Central Asia, Japan, and Australia and New Zealand. The different countries have different birth rates according to their culture, to their economic situation, and so on. And that leads the country to take different policies, such as the pro-natalist policies that are the one that try to encourage great families in a country, and the anti-natalist policies, which are the one that want the opposite, so that the families have less and less. Then we can see that the birth depends on several factors. We can measure the birth on the according to the fertility rate, which is the number of children per woman, that leads to the generational replacement. The generational replacement that you should know, as it's in the exam preparation, means that for the population to remain the same, so for the population to be the same number of people as they were in previous generation, each family, each couple had two children. So the father and the mother had to have two children in order to the population of a country to maintain the same number of people. The factors that affect on birth rate can be socioeconomic. So the economic level, remember that the poor countries normally have a higher birth rate, as the children are a help for the economy of the families. They can work on the land, they can work on factories if child labor is allowed, and so on. While in the richest countries, having children is not an advantage, but it's very expensive because you have to educate the children, education is compulsory, you want to give them toys, leisure activities, a good quality of life, which is expensive. And also the culture can affect to that. For example, countries that are used to have very large families as a synonym of wealth, of prosperity, and so on, maybe for religious reasons that favor the larger families, or that don't allow the use of contraceptive methods that can stop pregnancies and can stop the woman from having more children. And of course, social factors such as the economical structure or the structure of the society. For example, when the woman access to jobs. If a woman starts having her own career, her own studies, and so on, she won't stay on the house taking care of the children, but they will prefer having their own life. They can have children, but they have also different occupations, so they won't have as many children as in the past. This is one of the reasons of why the most developed countries that has the highest rates of working women has less children, and for that reason less birth rate. And then the policies of the government that can be pro-natalist or anti-natalist. Pro-natalist means that the government wants the families to have more kids. This will be typical of the developed countries, the the richest countries, so speaking. The developed countries will prefer pro-natalist policies as they want the families to have more and more kids. Why? Because the families in the developed countries are getting smaller. The women, as we have said, had less and less children. To compensate for that, the government want them to have more. For example, with the discount for the numerous families and so on. In the opposite side, we can find the antinatalist policies, which is typical of the less developed countries. Why the less developed countries have antinatalist policies? Because their families are already very large. The women have a lot of children, and that can cause overpopulation. To prevent overpopulation to happen, they have these antinatalist policies. Then, on the opposite side of the spectrum of population, we can find the death rate. The death rate measures the number of deaths in a country divided by the number of inhabitants, so the people that live in that country, per 1,000. This is again a per mile uh, result. We can see here the number of death, well, the number of death per 1,000 people in countries. The lighter, the darker the blue, the less death rate, and the darker the red, the higher the death rate is. This is the female mortality rate, which is a little bit different. Male mortality rate. Male mortality rate is a bit higher in general, and especially in the less developed countries, as they suffer normally from wars, from violent crimes, and so on, and they have a riskier lifestyle, so speaking. So they are more affected for that. Anyway, we can see that the countries with the highest the death rate are especially in Africa and in some part of Central Asia and so on. The death rate directly affects to the life expectancy. Life expectancy, as you know from the exam preparation, is the number of years a person is expected to live in a certain country as an average. For example, the most developed countries have a higher life expectancy, while the less developed ones, as we can see here in Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and the south of Asia as well, have lower life expectancy. This is an average. For example, when we see that these countries have a life expectancy of less than 60 years, actually in some places it can reach as low as 40 or even 30 years of life expectancy, it doesn't mean that everybody that reaches 60 years dies. No, what it means is that the average is 60 years. There are some people that live past the 60 year, but there are lots of them that die before uh, reaching that age. Here, the mortality, we can see how it affects on life expectancy that we have already explained. A very important indicator is the infant mortality rate, so the mortality rate for kids under 1 year old. And the mortality is affected by several factors, such as nutrition, so the amount of food and the quality of the food that a population can have. If a population is well fed, they will be healthier, they won't be affected by famines, they will survive better to to the happenings that they will suffer. And in the opposite case, the mortality, the death rate will be much higher. And also the access to hygiene and health services. Well, this is of course an error. It should be hygiene. I will correct it in a moment. The G, but of course it's the well the lack of pollution, that the cities are clean, that they can have a healthcare of quality that can prevent uh, epidemics from happen or to control them and so on. Here we can see the natural increase. Natural increase is what we get when we combine death rate and birth rate. We just subtract birth minus deaths and we can find the growth of population. If a population have a lot of births and very few deaths, it will grow a lot. If the deaths are higher, the population won't grow as much. Here we can see that the map is similar to the others we have already seen, as the sub-Saharan countries are the ones that are growing more. Why? They've got a lot of deaths, but they have much more births. We will explain that later, but with a higher number of births, the population will grow a lot. While in the most developed countries, such as in Western Europe, North America, Australia, and so on, the growth of population is much lower. They are still growing, but in Central and East Europe, in Central Asia, and so on, the population can even be below zero, so a negative growth. Why? Because there are less births than deaths in these areas. Natural increase is the number of births minus the number of deaths divided by the number of people in a country per 100. In this case, we can have a percentage, a regular percentage measured as we know. We can see that the average natural increase in the world is around 1.2%, which is very low, but there are great differences between the areas of the world. It is lower in the developed countries as the births are very low, and that means that they also have an aging population, so a lot of old people. Why? Because there are very few births and also very few deaths, so not many people is born and they can live for a lot of years. Then, in the less developed countries, we can see that it's very high. The natural increase is much greater than in the developed countries. They have a lot of young population, lots of young people, and the young people have more and more children, so the population will grow. Here we can see a population pyramid. This is a very important kind of graph that we have to know. It's very well explained in your book in page 136, 137. So please check them. There are different kind of pyramid. We will study them. The progressive pyramids, well, the expanding pyramids and the contracting pyramids according to your book. They show the population in a place, a country, Spain in this case, in a time, 2015, divided by the age groups. So from 0 years old to 4 years old, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, etc. Here we can see which age are the most common in a country. For example, we can see that for Spain in 2015, the ages from 35 to 59 approximately are the most common ones. That means that this population is old, it's an aging population, while the younger people, less than 30 years old, are much less than the adult and older people. The bars are much shorter. Okay? This is very typical of the most developed countries. Remember, the most developed countries have less births, so the bars here that show the children are shorter, and have a high life expectancy. So there are a lot of old people. You can see that there are an important amount of people older than 90 years old, which is, of course, very old. If we compare this per another country, in this case Kazakhstan, in 2014, we can see that the shape is very different. The Spanish pyramid had very few kids and a lot of old people, right? In this case, we can see that the larger bars are the younger ones, while the old people are much less than in the other pyramid, so the bars are shorter. This is very important because they show a completely different kind of country. They have a lot of births, so a lot of kids, and very few, well, and a lot of deaths as well, as the old people are very few as well. Also, when in a pyramid we find some kind of gap, some spaces where there should have been population, but there aren't, like this or this, that means that there has been some kind of crisis, because in a regular pyramid the population should continue like this. If we can find a place with missing population, that means that for those years there was a famine, so hunger, or maybe a war, or maybe some kind of economic crisis that led that made the parents to don't have children and so on. This will be for the end of the Soviet Union. Of course, you don't have to know which crisis happened, but you should know that in this period some kind of crisis took place. This is very important. These are the two main kinds of pyramids. Those are very well explained in your book, and they are named as expanding and contracting pyramids. Let's go one by one, but those are the cases that we have already studied. So this will be an expanding pyramid, while this will be a contracting pyramid. In the first case, we've got a pyramid which shows a population that is growing. There are lots of young people, there are lots of children, and there are very few old people. It has a shape of a real pyramid, we can see. It's a triangular shape. The young population is very, very common, while there are much less old population. This is the kind of pyramid that we can find in a less developed country, or from the past. We can see that this kind of pyramid was in Kazakhstan, or in this case we can find that it's in Spain, but not nowadays, but in the year 1900. So more than 100 years in the past. While this other kind of pyramid, the contracting pyramid, is typical of the developed countries and in the present. This is the pyramid of Spain nowadays, and the pyramid of other developed countries. We can see that it has a strange shape. It's a shape of an urn, like a vessel, like a recipient. It doesn't show a triangular shape. It's not a pyramid with a shape of a pyramid. In fact, that it's called pyramid anyway. So this will be for developed countries in the present. And we can see that there are some missing people here and here, where the young people should have been they aren't. So this is because the people in this kind of countries they decide to have less and less and less children. Remember that the woman start having jobs, uh, taking care of children start being more expensive. They simply prefer for cultural and social changes to have less kids in each family. And as the medicines are better, the sanitary methods are better, the hygiene and so on develop, there are more and more old people. There are normally more old female people or women than men because they have a different lifestyle, especially for old people, as they had a different cultures while they were growing, and simply for the biological nature of the female body. So here we can see that they have less kids and a lot of old people. This shows an aging population, while this one shows a young population. That's very, very important. Got these two examples of pyramid. This is what in your book called an expanding pyramid because the population is expanding, and here is a contracting pyramid because the population is not. Here we can see the evolution of a population pyramid from an old stage in which they were an expanding pyramid with a triangular shape to a modern stage with a contracting pyramid that doesn't have this triangular shape. This is what the developed countries pass. They start having less and less and less kids and more old people. This is the regular evolution. We can see it here with more details throughout the years. For Spain, if we saw a pyramid from Germany, from France, from the UK, will be pretty much the same. And also we can notice that there's a gap. So there's a place where there are no people like this that started in these years. This is the gap that corresponds with the civil war and the post-war in Spain, as there are many people that should have been born in that time that they weren't for the deaths and so on. And also we can see a moment where the population simply expands. It's not that the shape of the pyramid changes, but they continue until they grow like this. This is due to immigration because it's not an increase in children, it's an increase in old people. The only possibility of having more old people, more adults in a country is that those adults has entered into that country, because if not they will start from the base and they will grow, but they don't grow, they just appear here. So they are immigrants, they are people that enter into this country. So this is the explanation that we have already commented. The expanding pyramid, that remember is this one, the triangular one, has a high birth rate. How can we know it? Because they show a lot of young people. So these bars are very long. For that reason, it's a young population. They have a longer life expectancy for women. This is common for both pyramids because women normally live more years than men. They have a high mortality. The top of the pyramid have very short bars because of the problems this country can have. Wars, illnesses, epidemics, famine, and so on and so on. And this is typical of less developed countries that have all of these problems and for that reason have these characteristics. On the other side, we've got the contracting pyramids, which are the ones that have this shape. They have a low birth rate. For that reason, the bars for the children are shorter. We can see it here. The bars that the children, where the children should have, are shorter than the adult ones, and they have a low mortality rate. So there are lots of old people. That's the great difference with the other one. If there are lots of old people and not many children, that means that they have an aging population, an old population. They have longer life expectancy for women. Life expectancy is higher than in the less developed countries, and especially for women. The natural increase is slow. That's very important. If there aren't many deaths, but there aren't many births either, the population won't grow so much. Here, the natural increase, the population growth, is much greater because of the birth rate. And we've got an aging population, and it's typical of the developed countries. Well, here it says uh, it's in Spanish, but of course I mean the aging population. As this one is the first one is a younger population, the second one is an aging population. Then we know that the things that can affect to the population of an area are just four processes: the births, so the people that is born, the deaths, the people that dies, and the other two factors that can affect a population are the people that enters into a country, so immigration, and the people that leaves a country, so emigration. We are talking now about immigration and emigration. The birth and the death, we have already covered them, and we should complete it. Here we can see the most common migration flows of the planet, how they especially go from Asia, which is the most populated area, to other parts of Asia, or to North America, Europe, and so on. Then from Africa, they go especially to the south of Europe, because it's closer. And from South America, they go to south of Europe, especially to Spain, of course, for the similarities in language, culture, and here we can see the net migration rates. The migration rate is the amount of people that enters a country less the amount of people that leaves a country. So emigrants less immigrants. If it's positive, it means that more people enter than the people that leaves. It's typical of the richest countries, North America, Western Europe, Australia and New Zealand, because they receive population, or those countries that aren't as rich as the other but are in better conditions than the surrounding countries. On the other side, the negative net migration shows those countries that have more emigrants than immigrants, which are especially Africa, South Asia and Southeast Asia, and South and Central America and Mexico that go to these countries in blue. Here we can see it with arrows. In red, the areas that receive population, and in green, the areas that uh, leave, send population. Here we can see the list of countries with more people in Spain. This is a list of immigrants in Spain. You can see on top Morocco with 600,000 people, then Romania with almost 600,000 people. This is Spain. It talks about the people that was living outside Spain and entering Spain, they came back. And then we've got the United Kingdom. This is a different kind of immigrants, as they aren't young workers that come here to find better living conditions, but they are normally old people that retire to the coast of Spain. Then China, and then the South American countries. Most of South American countries, Colombia, Ecuador, Argentina, Bolivia, Venezuela, and so on, that come to Spain for the similarities in culture, language. We can see the migration in Spain, which is positive. That's very important because this compensates the growth. This is the natural growth of Spain, which is in fact negative. The population in Spain wouldn't be growing if there were no immigrants. There are 8,000 more deaths than births in Spain, or there were in 2016, and this is estimated that the deaths will be over the birth in a great amount for 2030. So the population will start decreasing, and if it hasn't decreased yet, it's because of the immigration. There are more immigrants than the decrease of the population. So the population can still grow a little, but according to the years pass, the population will start decreasing from 46 million people to 45 million people to 41 million people, because even if the migrations are increasing, the natural growth is decreasing. Why? Because of the aging population that we have already talked about, and it's very, very, very important. The aging population means that there are more old people and less young people that can have children. So the population decreases. The most common example of migration is what we call the rural exodus. The rural exodus is the movement of people from the countryside to the city. We will copy that as a definition. That can mean that some areas are getting empty, such as some countries or small countryside or small villages in the middle of the. And here we can see how Europe has normally had lots of immigrants. So lots of people went outside Europe to other places, America, Africa, Asia. Those are the first pilgrim that went to the shore of which nowadays is the United States. They are voluntary and also forced migration. The forced migrations are the ones that weren't decided by the people. The people were forced to travel. The main example will be slavery. Here we can see one of the consequences of migration, which are the cultural exchange. This is the Chinese neighborhood in Mexico. Or a very important examples of the migration are the refugees. Refugees are special uh, immigrants, as they don't travel just looking for a job or looking for a better living condition, but they are forced to travel, flying from a war, a persecution. And here we can see the countries in Europe that have a higher percentage of immigrants. It's higher in the in the richest countries. So migrations, we can see here the net migration rate, the immigrant less the emigrant, so the people that enters into a country less the minus the people that leaves a country. If it's positive, it means that more people enters than leaves, and if it's negative, it means that more people leaves than enter. The net migration rate is positive in the developed countries and is negative in the less developed countries. Why? Because the developed countries receive more people and the less developed countries send more people to other places. This can balance in some way the difference in growth. The developed countries, as you know, have a low growth, but with the immigrant population, they can grow more, while the less developed countries have a very high growth, and with immigrants, the immigrants they send, they can balance this excessive growth and fight overpopulation. The migration have different causes. Social causes, looking for better conditions, or for example, if there are persecutions due to religion, culture, language, race, ethnicity, and so on. Economic, if a country has a bad economic situation, they will send people to countries in a better conditions. Environmental, because, for example, a flood where too much water covered the land, or an earthquake, or a natural disaster, a disease, something like this. And political or religious. For example, because there's a civil war, there are conflicts, there are intolerance, and so on, so they have to leave their countries. The types can be permanent, when they go to a different country to stay there, temporary, when they have planned to move as soon as they can, and a particular type which is seasonal. Seasonal means that the population go forth and back. So they go to a different country and then they go back, or a different area. This is typical of the agriculture. In agriculture, there are some specific times of the year where they don't have so much work. So they can go to other places, to a city or to another country to work there, and then they go back for the harvest season. For example, the time they have to collect or the crops and so on. It's a kind of migration where they every year or every couple of years they go to a different country and then they go back. Then it can also be international when they move to a different country, or internal when they move inside their own country. And it can be voluntary when they decide to move, or forced when they haven't decided to move but they are forced to do it for a war or for some other reason. The rural exodus is the movement of people from the countryside to the city. It's an example of internal migration. The cities are the areas of the world that are growing at the fastest pace. This is because of the population prefer moving there than moving to the countryside, because in the city there are more options for working and so on. So this is a definition, rural exodus. Remember that we should know all of the definitions, so please copy this and study it. Rural exodus is a movement of population, so it's a kind of migration, from the countryside, the rural areas, for that reason it's called that way, to the cities in search of a job and better living conditions. So just looking for a better place to live. Throughout history, there has been lots of different migration. This is, for example, during the Spanish Civil War, that lots of people were forced to leave Spain to France, and they end up in refugee camps, like the ones that we can find nowadays from Syria and so on. This is a camp of refugees, but they are Spanish in France. The control of borders is a very important part of the migration policies. Spain, for example, does it in Ceuta and Melilla, and it has different consequences. For example, what is called the brain drain. This is the movement of people with a high level of education. For example, they are expert, they are university students, and so on, that go to another place, and this new country can have the benefits from their knowledge. An example will be Albert Einstein, who was a German immigrant that had to flee from Germany due to the Nazis. Another example in Spain will be Juanelo Turriano, which was an Italian that came to Spain and designed lots of machines and so on in the 16th century. A difficult consequence could be the rise of mafias that control the migration or can uh, make the immigrants to join them in order to live in that country and so on. The Italian mafia in the United States is one of the most typical examples. Here we can see the FBI agents arresting mafia. And another bad consequences of the immigration could be the rise of racism and intolerance in general. Groups of people that reject the immigrants for their race, for their culture, their religion, and migration can lead to a mix of cultures. For example, this is the Great Mosque in London that shows how the religion in London is now a combination of different different origins. Uh, Here we can see Muslim people who aren't originally from the English culture that has established there. The reach of Europeans to Asia could be another, with the cultural transfer, and of course the problems of integration, the problems for the immigrant people to mix with the society. Or, on the opposite side, the possibilities of already combine their cultures. This is the Chinese neighborhood in, or the Dia de los Muertos in Mexico that combines the Christian religion brought them by the Spanish with the traditional religion they have there. So migration have lots of different consequences. For the countries of origin, so the countries that send immigrants, it has a negative consequence, which is the aging of the population. As the immigrants are normally young people that are searching for a job, the people that remain in that country are old. And on the other hand, the positive consequences will be the less pressure on resources. These countries normally have a lack of resources. Could be food, water, money in general, or whatever economic thing. And if more people is living that area, the remaining people will have more resources for them. Less unemployment, this is very typical. Countries that have a high unemployment rate will send immigrants to other places, so they won't be so many people in their countries without a job to live. And the money they send home, that's very important, because the immigrants normally have a family in their country of origin, and when they find a job in a new country, they will send money to those families, so the country will receive more and more money from the people who is outside. In the countries of arrival, so the countries where immigrants go, the countries that receive immigrants can have negative consequences, the cost of healthcare and education for more people, the problems of integration, that's important as there are some groups of immigrants that can be difficult to integrate, the culture, exclusion of and xenophobia by the very people of the country that can reject these new people that enters. And the positive consequences can be the entrance of young population that can compensate this aging population that we have seen in the most developed countries. The existence of a graded workforce, that's important as well. The aging population have a lot of old people and not many young people. So there are less people to work. And if there are less people to work, they will need workers. And the immigrants can be these workers to enter in those countries. And more active population. That's very important. The active population is the people that can work. We'll explain that later. That can also contribute to social security payments. The immigrants pay taxes, and these taxes go to the government that help all the people in the country. This is the definition of active population that we should know. They are people in legal age for working, so in Spain older than 16 years old, that work or are looking for a job. That's very important. Unemployed people, so people that don't have a job, but they are looking for one, they are active population. People that don't look for a job because they are studying, because they are sick, because they are very old, because they can't work, or simply because they don't want to work, they aren't active population. Active population are just people that has a job or looking for one. So we can go back to this. We have said that in the world there are 7 million people, and these 7 million people had grown throughout the centuries. They have had a constant growth, but not at the same pace, not at the same uh, speed. We can see that the growth of population was very, very slow throughout the centuries until they start growing a lot. In very recent times, we can see how it goes well, it goes back in time, but here it starts growing, especially here in the 19th century. The 19th century is a very important date for the growth of population because it's the time when the population starts changing, the society changes, there are more advances. So, population growth. We are nowadays more than 7 billion people. And to study the growth of population, there are several models, several ways to study the population. One for the developed countries and one for the emerging and less developed countries. Emerging countries are countries whose economy is growing a lot. So they are emerging from the poor to the world of the rich. And less developed are the countries that don't have a higher such a higher economic level as the other. The population growth has also a rate, which is the natural increase plus the net migration rate. That's very important. Remember, the natural increase was the number of births less the number of deaths. So, with a lot of births and very few deaths, the natural increase will be very, very, very high. The net migration rate was the amount of people that enters into a country, so immigrants, less the people that go out that country, so the emigrants. This shows how the global population is growing or not. For example, the richest countries can have a very low natural increase that can even be negative because the births are very low and the deaths are very high, but they have a positive migration rate, so they will receive more and more people. The population in emerging and less developed countries is growing a lot, while the richest countries don't have such a great growth of population, and especially in urban areas. Remember, urban areas are cities, are the areas that are growing the most because of the rural exodus that we have already talked. There are different ways to measure the wealth of a country. One of the most important is the HDI, the Human Development Index, HDI, but it shows the quality of life of the different countries. We can see the darker the green, the higher quality of life in the richest countries, Western Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, and the darker the red, the less quality of life, which is especially in South African countries. This is important because the growth of population is different for the developed and the non-developed or emerging countries. The developed countries have a high per capita income. The per capita income is the amount of money that a country receives divided between the number of people. So the amount of money that a person obtains as an average. And also the consumption, how much they can consume, the economic growth, the the possibilities the economy to grow, and they have also advanced industries and infrastructure. So when we are talking about the developed countries, we're talking about all of this. When we are talking about an emerging country, they have an increase in production and wealth. So the production and wealth aren't as good as in the developed countries, but they are increasing their quality. The economy is modernizing, so it's growing. They have industrialization, so they are adopting new industries, and they are develop their services, their schools, hospitals, transports, and so on. The education level is low. In many cases, they can't provide basic education to everybody, and only few people can go to university and so on. And infrastructures, roads, hospitals, and so on are bad. The less developed countries have a very low per capita income, so each person receives a very little amount of money. They have low consumption, so they cannot consume as much as other countries. They have scarce infrastructures. Well, there's another typo here. There should be an F here in infrastructure. And they have a low education level. In many cases, there are still people that can't read and write in those countries because there aren't possibilities of expanding the schools, universities, and so on. The population has continuously grew from prehistory to our modern at a different pace. They have been affected by illnesses, wars, conflicts, and until the 19th century. Remember, we said that this was a very important date in our unit, 19th century, that we have to know, because it's the time where the world starts developing, especially the countries that are nowadays developed, Europe, North America, start having factories, better medical doctors with a higher preparation, antibiotics, and so on. that allow the people to grow more and more and finally to reach higher life expectancies, so the population start getting old. This is a very important graph. It shows the main stages of the evolution of population. First, we've got the ancient demographic region. So we can see the ancient region. Then the transition, or how it's called in your book, the population explosion. And the modern regime, the modern demographic regime. And these two lines show the birth and the death rate. In red, we've got the birth rate, and in green, we've got the death rate. And the difference between the lines is how the population is growing. Where the births are much higher than the births are much higher than the death, the population will grow a lot. There are a lot of difference. When the births are under the death, that means that the population won't grow at all. So there are some points in history where the population could decrease, which are the ones in which there are more deaths than births. This is because of what is called uh, the catastrophic deaths, the catastrophic mortality, catastrophe in general. And for the main part of history, we can see that the population is growing. Why is it growing? Because the births are higher than the deaths. So in all of these areas, the population is growing, and it is growing a lot, especially here. Why? Here, in the first part, in the ancient region, we can see that the birth and death rate are very close. They are all together, and both of them are high. There are many people that is born and many people that dies. This is for the old times. The families had lots and lots of children because the death rate was very high. There were many possibilities of the people to die, wars, illnesses, and so on. But what happened? Here, there's a change. This will be, as we have already mentioned, the 19th century. The 19th century saw a great change in history because due to the medicine, the new technological advances and so on, the death rate started decreasing. But you can see that the births continue being a lot of higher than the death. So if very few people dies and a lot of people is born, that means that the population will grow a lot, in this time. For that reason, this is called a population explosion because the population multiplies several times. On the opposite side, we can see how the birth rate is decreasing. While, why? Because the population is changing. We said that in the modern times, women have less children, they start going after uh, careers and trying to have their own jobs and so on. And having children is expensive, people have other interests, and also there aren't so many deaths, so you don't need to have lots of children hoping for some of them to survive, because most of them are expected to survive anyway. So there are less births. If there are less births, the growth won't be as much as it was. and we can reach these modern times. Here, the death rate is very, very, very low. Is it low because of the technological advances in medicine and so on? But the birth rates are low as well. There aren't many people that want to have lots of children. So you can see that here the birth rate was high and the death rate was high as well. So the growth was low because many people was born, but many people died as well. On the other side, we can see that the birth and the death, both of them are low. So if very few people dies and very few people is born, the population will grow very little as well. So they will have also a low growth. On the other hand, in this central area, we have lots of births and less and less and less deaths. So the growth will be very high. For that reason, it's called a population explosion. Here we've got the explanation of this situation. It's exactly what we have already said. There are three stages: the pre-industrial stage, the population explosion, and the modern demographic region. The pre-industrial stage is called that way because it's before of the industries, before of the factories, the medical advances, and so on. The birth and death rates were both very high. They've got a lot of catastrophic mortality, so they were affected by wars, illnesses, and so on. Nowadays, we can still suffer them, but we in our modern countries don't have as many wars or as terrible wars as there were in the past or there are nowadays in the poorer countries. If we suffer an economic crisis, it won't be as terrible as in other places. Even in times of diseases or epidemics, they are much controlled than in other possible areas. So the natural increase, so the growth of population is very low. The population won't grow. Then here, in the population explosion that happened in the 19th century, there will be improvement in agriculture and medical care, so the death rate will decrease because of this, but the birth rate will continue being higher. Think that this continues. Okay, they were used to have lots of kids, and this will be exactly the same. They will also used to die a lot, but due to the medical advantages and the advantages in agriculture and so on, the deaths will decrease. So there are less deaths, but the people didn't have really a reason for start having less kids at that specific point. So they will continue having very large families. But the thing is, if you have a very large family and the people won't die as much as before, the natural increase will be very, very, very high. This is why the population had an explosion. The population multiplied a lot. Then the modern demographic regime is when this changes. Why? Because of the female work, the contraceptive measures, the advances in medicine and sanitation that mean that the death rate will continue decreasing, but the birth rate will, for first time, decrease as well. So the birth rate will have a decline, they will decrease, and the death rate is already low. And also, they've got a high life expectancy. People is expected to live lots of years. So, what does it mean? That the population will grow very, very low, very slowly. They won't have a great growth, and the population will be old. We will have an aging population. This is very important. It's probably the most important part of our unit because it's everything we have been talked about before. So please try to understand it, and if there are any questions, just ask me. If we compare this with the pyramids we have already seen, these two stages will have this kind of pyramids, right? Which we call the expanding pyramids, with a lot of children because they have very high birth rate and very few old people because the death rates are high as well. While this modern situation will have the pyramids that we have said the modern countries have, which is like this. Because the death rate is low, so there are a lot of old people, and the birth rate is low as well, so there aren't many young people. I know this, there are a lot of drawings in this image, so this can be a little bit chaotic, but don't worry about that. Remember, this is a video. You can pause it and rewatch it as many times as you want. I'll try to erase all of this just in case you need it for some reason. And remember that you should understand this very well. Okay. The developed countries have some characteristics for their population. They have an aging population, lots of old people that have some characteristics. It costs a lot in healthcare and pensions. So the government spend a lot of money taking care of these old people. Also, the active population, remember, active population is the people that is working or looking for a job, has decreased because the old people don't work, they are retired. And the growth is low or even negative because of the old people. They won't have kids, and for that reason the growth will be very low or can even be negative. So instead of a growth, we've got a decrease in population. Fortunately, developed countries have a positive net migration, except in cases of economic crisis and so on. This is important because it can compensate for this low or negative growth that we have talked about. And for that reason, the government have pro-natalist policies. They want the people to have more kids. By the way, it's important to know that crisis in English is singular. So this is one crisis. But when we talk about many crises, it's like this with an E. I'm sorry. This is a map of the old and young population in the world. In green, we can see the younger countries, and in pink, the older ones. The older ones are the most developed countries. The green ones are the less developed ones. All of this is related. If I ask you, how are these countries? You can say they are developed. And this one are less developed. If I ask you how is the population pyramid of these countries, for this we'll have this shape with few kids and lots of all people, and for this they will have this shape with few old people and lots of younger. And here we can know the birth rate, death rate, and so on and so on and so on. Everything in this unit is related, so we need to be able to understand this. For that reason, in the countries in the world that are growing the fastest are the South Saharan countries, such as Nigeria. These are the population, the streets of Abuja, and here the less developed countries. This is exactly the same as we see for the developed countries, but instead of having three stages, we have just two. Why? Because they don't have the third stage, which will be the modern regime. They have the first one, the second one, but they haven't reached the third one. Remember, if we have this graph that we absolutely need to know, it's very, very important for us to know it. We can notice how if the graph goes like this, and we will have the birth, the deaths, and the three stages. This was the pre-industrial stage, the population explosion, and the modern regime. These less developed countries hasn't reached this final stage, and that explains a lot about their situation. So let's see. The pre-industrial stage, as we know, they have very high birth rate and very high death rate as well. So the growth is very slow. If both lines are together, there aren't a great difference between birth and death, so the growth is slow. And instead of lasting until the 19th century, this went up to the 20th century. The second stage, the population explosion, ended at the end of the 20th century, and it has a high birth rate, but the death rate is descending very fast because of the technological advances, the medicines, and so on. So the growth is very, very, very high because they are in this second stage, the population explosion, which is exactly as we mentioned for the developed countries. The difference is that developed countries have reached this third stage, while the less developed countries are still here. They will go to the third stage, but later. That means that there's a lot of young population. They have low life expectancy as the death rate is descending but still is higher than in the richest countries. The net migration is negative because they have too much young people that want to go out to other countries with better conditions. They have anti-natalist policies. That means that they want to have less children. And there are a great contrast between urban areas and rural areas, so the countryside and the cities. Remember that cities are growing a lot, is where the economic level is better, and so on. And as always, if we wanted to know how the population pyramid for those areas will be, it will be a pyramid like this, with lots of young people and very few old people because life expectancy is low. Everything is related and everything is the same always. Here we can see the map that we already know about the density of population, and we know most of the people is concentrated in Southeast Asia and also in the developed areas where they receive lots of population, especially Central Europe, this area that goes from London to Milan, the north of Africa that has a great growth population, sub-Saharan Africa, which is the fastest growing area in the world, and the coast of the United States that receive a lot of population, and Central America and Mexico that also is growing a lot. The reasons of why there are more people in those areas than the other are very different. For example, the climates. We know that in the hottest and the coldest climates, there aren't lots of people. They prefer the temperate climate or the cooler areas in the warm climates like this. Also, the fertile lands, the land that can be cultivated in agriculture because it's the main source of food for the people, Southeast Asia, Europe, North America, the resources they had, and that explain how there are some areas without almost any people, such as the most extreme climates, the desert, the colder areas, or the deep jungles, which are very good for population because they aren't good for agriculture, so they don't offer the possibility of having as much food places. Areas such as Mongolia don't have lots of population, and they have a great amount of population which is nomad. They move from one place to the other. They have deserts and so on, as you can see. And on the other side, the largest cities, such as Tokyo, which is a great city, probably the greatest city in the planet, with more than 20 million people, which is half the population of Spain, and it covered the most part of the main island in, or the Ciudad de Mexico, Mexico DF, that is the largest urban area in the world with 30 million. We can see how Europe is a continent of cities. This shows the difference in population density. Population density, remember, is the amount of people per square kilometer, per surface. We can see that there are much higher population density in this area than, for example, here, which are larger areas with less people. The highest density of population is in Asia, the most populated, and we can study it like this. A census is a document created by the government that studies the amount of people in an area and what do they do for live, if they are married, they aren't, or so on. The density of population is very important, and it can be calculated as the number of people divided by the square kilometers. And it shows the the highest the most densely populated areas in the world. The reasons of why some areas have more people than others are explained in these factors. They can be physical factors, the climate. People prefer warmer climates, which are better for living, the relief, land fertility, and resources. For example, the highest mountains aren't good for life. If there aren't enough lands that allow the people to have agriculture to eat, there won't be as many people, and other resources such as water or oil that can create a great economic wealth. Historical reasons, for example, lasting population. The most important empires in history are nowadays very populated areas such as Mesopotamia, China, India, and even the Mayans and Aztecs in Central America. The birth rates, the areas with higher birth rates, such as Sub-Saharan Africa, are densely populated. And the migrations, the areas that receive lots of people, such as Europe or North America, will have a lot of population. and economic and social, the economy, the working and living conditions, services, freedoms. The best situation these countries have, the more people will want to live there. And if the situation is bad, more people will leave these areas. And if the situation is extremely bad, they can even die. So the population will be lower. With this, we have ended our presentation and our unit. This was all the things that you have to know for this unit 8. So please study them carefully, try to understand them. You will have to be able to do and understand these population pyramids. You need to know where the highest density of population is located. And you also have to understand the demographic evolution, which is this graph that we have already studied. That explains the births and deaths throughout history. Okay, we need to know this graph as well as the population pyramids that we have mentioned in the different shapes. We need to be able to comment them and to explain them if needed. That was all. So if you have any question, remember that you can always write me to my email, which is prof.jaimeariasjimenez@gmail.com. prof.jaimeariasjimenez at gmail.com. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you've got any question, any doubt, any comment, anything that you want to add, anything that you want me to explain again, please ask me. I know the situation is difficult, so please continue working, don't lose your spirit, and well, have a great day. Thank you.